And now I'd like to give the floor to Kit Kowalski. Kit.
So hi everyone, I'm Kit Kowalski and I'm going to be talking about ACON and the ABC. Not in the way I usually talk about ACON and the ABC. This time I'm actually going to be talking about Media Watch episode 35, ACON and the ABC, subtitle, Paul Barry Pokes the Bear. So Monday, 17th of October, Media Watch did the unthinkable. They presented a 15-minute spot on the ABC's relationship with ACON. They used data that was publicly available on a website called ACON Exposed. And it was significant for a number of reasons. Primarily, they broke the silence. They broke the spell around no debate. They named ACON as a key player in the gender identity movement. They linked them strongly to Stonewall and referred to the Nolan Report on Stonewall Diversity Champions and the BBC. Significantly, they referred to key hard evidence of the money, the time, the effort being spent to participate in ACON's AWEI scheme. And they had evidence of ACON's influence over ABC editorial policy and content. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth analysing the article, but I will point you to a fantastic piece which is on the Women's AWEI website called Auntie, Review Your Relationship with ACON. I did just want to give a little bit of the background as to how the episode came about. So as often with these things, when they're happening, you get, they talk to a lot of different people and you really don't get a full picture. So I've spoken to a number of people who were involved in putting the episode together. And it really does look like it was driven by the Media Watch team. And in my opinion, I think that we just reached a critical mass of awareness within the ABC that there is a debate going on, that we're not being heard, and that there's actually critical consequences to ignoring this debate. Now, I know we might think of the ABC as being aware of these issues because they're constantly putting out content that is actively promoting gender identity theory. But within the organisation, it's not homogenous. So there are these pockets of, and I've heard them described as scary young people who are spreading these gender identity theories. And then there's just everybody else who's just getting on with their job and, doing what they need to do. And so, we've got this situation where to us, it looks like they're fully aware of the issues and they're ignoring them. But on the inside, there are people who really don't know what's going on. So in my mind, there has actually, we reached a critical mass of awareness in the ABC. And this has been achieved over time by, for example, protests like we saw WAC doing a protest, or Women's AWEI protesting, or IWD Brisbane Meanjin protesting outside of the ABC, and all of the numerous chalkings that have been taking place outside ABC offices. ABC do take note. They take photographs, they interview the protesters, and they take a pamphlet back. And it probably just goes in a file drawer somewhere. But when we reach that critical tipping point of awareness, they have those materials there on hand to refer to. Same with letter writing. I'm aware of many women writing to the ABC over and over again over a sustained period. In particular, I just want to call out a psychologist, Sandra Perto, who I'm aware of having a rather sustained and in-depth correspondence with Fiona Cameron, who is the ABC's internal ombudswoman. And Sandra has done a valiant effort actually pointing the ombudswoman to resources such as ACON Exposed, such as Women's AWEI, and sending her, among other things, pictures of AGPs to sort of prove that this is not something that she's just, making up in a moral panic. And those concerns were actually taken on board to some extent. So it is really important, I think, that Media Watch drove the story and that it wasn't spoon-fed by a couple of gender-critical activists. Gender-critical activists did give them information, did give them facts, but they went away, they interviewed people, they looked at the evidence, and they came to the same conclusions. What was a really key turning point was the Pride and Prejudice in Policy Forum that was held in the University of Melbourne. So one of the key strategy points here was that the organisers actually did involve ABC journalists, and a number of things happened. They involved ABC and they involved ACON. ACON dropped out. Some of the ABC participants dropped out and had to be replaced by other ABC participants. They got to see that instead of coming in to join and have a civil debate, trans activists stood outside and tried to disrupt the forum. And they got to see the treatment of some of the ABC participants afterwards, how they were sort of maligned for being anti-trans, for wanting to just simply participate in a public debate. And really importantly, the ABC recorded that session. That recording was brought into the organisation and it was passed around to key journalists. And so we have this one event, and then that is backed up by all of that supplementary information, all those protests, all those letters, all of that correspondence, all of those complaints that were made over time. So this is clearly not just an isolated incident. This is an actual phenomenon, and it was enough to push Media Watch into investigating the story. Something I take away from this is that involving them was a really key strategy point, but just involving them the one time wouldn't have been enough. We still needed to have that sustained effort in bringing up the issues. The journalists that I spoke to at Media Watch and in other news outlets, they say, look, we weren't really aware. We don't know what's going on. It's no one's standing over us, telling us what we can and can't publish. However, we all know that it was an act of bravery for Media Watch to publish the story. And we all know that there was backlash from within the ABC afterwards. And that is how we know that there is control over editorial decisions, because there is an invisible line that they crossed. So published with the story were a statement by ACON, a statement by ABC, and also afterwards, a number of journalists within the ABC actually pushed back, not just on their own personal Twitter timelines, but at least two took to the airwaves during a Radio National broadcast to discuss the Media Watch episode and to really distance themselves from the Media Watch team. So they were using their platform provided to them by the ABC to make comments on how their relationship with ACON doesn't affect editorial content at all. And additionally, the next day after the Media Watch broadcast, there was an emergency meeting held by the ABC Pride Network to decide what to do and how they would all respond. And as a result, there has actually been some unfortunate language being used about Media Watch and about Paul Barry on Twitter and in other places. This is a familiar pattern from the trans activists. When they are questioned, when they are challenged, they push back with personal attacks. So I thought I would use this time to do a bit of a they said, we said, and look at some of the statements that have been made in the wake of the Media Watch broadcast and just challenge them a little bit. So first and foremost, there was the claim. Media Watch said that they got their documents from an anti-trans group. And Benjamin Law and Beverly Wang on ABC Radio National also spent quite a bit of time talking about how Media Watch was basically getting their material from an anti-trans group. So I have 3 challenges to this. Firstly, they're trying to force a confusion between not believing in gender essences, right, as in not supporting transgenderism, and being against transgender individuals or people who claim a transgender identity. So those 2 things are not the same. Secondly, ACON is supposed to actually represent the full LGBTQ spectrum. So claiming that challenging ACON is anti-trans shows their hand a little bit. Okay, it shows that what they're really interested in is the gender identity narrative. Nobody called ACON Exposed an anti-lesbian group, for example. And thirdly, it really doesn't matter whether or not ACON Exposed is an anti-trans group. They present primary data in context. The data was picked up by ABC Media Watch. Media Watch did their own investigation and they came to exactly the same conclusions, that the behaviours showed bias. So, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who handled the evidence speaks for itself. ACON claims that they are not a public advocacy program. They won't even use the word lobby group. The reason is that their remit and the reason that they receive $13 million from New South Wales Health and an additional $4 million from other government sources per annum, the reason they receive that money is for health advocacy. The reason they can do the Pride and Diversity program is because they link the idea that if you're able to be, quote, your whole self at work, then there will be better health outcomes. And in fact, in their statement, they even make an unsubstantiated claim that the AWEI has helped improve health outcomes for LGBTQ employees, right? They don't even make an attempt to substantiate that. They just say it. It's really important for them not to be seen as a lobby group. However, it's worth noting that a huge part of ACON's workplace programs focus on the development of allyship training. This isn't just advocacy or lobbying, but it's actively recruiting and training grassroots advocates. And this is happening in workplaces, including federal government workplaces across Australia. And if we're thinking about what is the definition of a lobby group, well, there's a broad definition, which is a group formed to influence legislation or policy on a particular issue. Or there's a particular definition used by the Attorney General's Department, which is undertaking communication in an effort to influence government decision-making. So, for example, promoting certain workplace practices and policies across federal government departments. In their statement, the ABC attempt to normalise participation in the AWEI. They start with the "mum, everyone's doing it" defence by stating that 186 employers across all sectors participate in the AWEI. To me, this simply shows us the scale of the issue. It doesn't justify their participation at all, particularly not as the national broadcaster, they have a singular role in our social and our political landscape. They say that the AWEI simply measures the impact of inclusion activities. Now, this can't be further from the truth. It doesn't measure anything. The AWEI doesn't ask, did you do this? Was it successful? It sets out an exhaustive list of activities and expectations with stringent requirements, and the majority of activities need to be repeated every single year. There is no progression towards maturity. There is point scoring there is level attainment, and there are awards for high scorers. They also claim that they participate in other diversity benchmarks, which is fine, but we're not talking about those diversity benchmarks. We're talking about the AWEI. Both ACON and the ABC go to lengths to say that ACON has no influence over editorial policies, standards, or content presented by the ABC. This is partially true. ACON doesn't dictate what content the ABC should put forward. In the AWEI submission, it merely leaves a blank space to put forward examples of work that might score a point, that might show your adherence to inclusion and diversity practices. In the AWEI submission, ABC puts forward examples of its work to gain points from ACON. MediaWatch showed actual examples of ACON pointing out what types of content would get them those points. And then that content made it into their submissions and gained points. ACON's stated aim is to use the AWEI to create cultural change in workplaces. And as we might know, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Through the instrument of the AWEI, ABC Pride has created a strong enough culture that when MediaWatch aired their segment, the next day the Pride group had to hold an emergency meeting. They have created a culture where the relationship with ACON is important and must be protected. They felt so threatened by questioning that relationship that they needed to strategize a response. Now remember, when ABC is putting forward examples of their work to get AWEI points, that their work is being the national broadcaster, right? So we talk about ABC Queer, an Instagram channel that promotes pseudoscience. It promotes all sorts of things under the Q umbrella. We talk about an additional channel, ABC Queer Newsletter, the Innies and Outies podcast, ABC acquiring the rights to broadcast the Mardi Gras, and ABC putting forward a number of articles and segments to receive points. When it comes down to deciding whether to produce segment A or segment B, if A comes with points attached, how do we, the public, know that those points didn't tip the balance in favour of that segment? The suggestion of that bias is enough. In their response, ABC pointed out that they aim to report on transgender issues without causing offence or undue stress to vulnerable communities. Now, I think as feminists, we might throw up our hands and say, well, what about the undue stress and offence caused to the other communities when their views are not taken into account? How about the stress and offence caused to women? I'd additionally point out that the ABC has an editorial policy, which is policy number 7, which actually states that in order for them to adequately reflect reality and adequately report on current affairs, this can result in challenging content which may offend some of the audience some of the time. In other words, they have the tools and they have the remit to report fairly on this issue, but they have chosen not to. They have chosen to privilege this group of people and essentially leave other voices out of the discourse. Now, just really quickly, I thought I would cover a couple of things that you can do now that we have broken the spell over no debate. Firstly, Women's QE, which is a very important resource when we're talking about ABC bias. Initially, I think started with Talk About It. So, and Talk About It is actually coming up this weekend. So grab some chalk, write a message, photograph it, put it on social media with the hashtag Talk About It. Bonus points if you do it in front of the ABC building. Secondly, you can write to the ABC. You can support Media Watch and Paul Barry. You can let them know that we want more of this kind of content, and you can let them know that we want Four Corners or the 7:30 report or some other investigative affairs program to dig deeper into this issue, because 15 minutes is not enough. They've barely scratched the surface. You can ask your MP to raise the issue with the Minister for Communications, mentioning the Media Watch segment, that lapses in ABC editorial standards, and call for a Senate inquiry. So this is building on what Karen said earlier. So definitely go and have a chat with your MP. And you can start a conversation. All you have to do is say, hey, did you watch Media Watch? You know, it's a very neutral question. Do you watch Media Watch? And you might follow it up with, do you know that we're in the same scheme? And last of all, don't underestimate the power of a few women tapping away into the night. You know, if you've got something that you're working on, just keep with it and keep going. So ACON Exposed, it was a year in the making. Women's QE was also a huge resource. Started back in June 2021, and now that website has photographs from women protesting the ABC all over the country, and it has several articles about ABC bias. And of course, keep writing letters, build networks, work together, and we'll win.